watch parts 1 and 2, you may understand how Kasai began taking shape due to activities outside of Kasai. The activities in question would be slave trade activities supporting the development of kingdoms. Each kingdom, interestingly, had either rulers or counterparts, leading and driving commerce and slave trade activities, whilst acting as ambassadors or agents for Arabian or European empires. The physical appearance of some of these leading commerce-driven individuals were usually ambiguous. For example, their facial phenotypes were not clearly consistent with the indigenous populations, even if they were dark-skinned, and they were more likely to be clothed and considered civilized in comparison to their captives. It was apparent some of these traders were clearly half European or half Arab, with a distinctively lighter brown skin tone, or they could be dark-skinned but have excessive facial hair growth, complementing the facial hair growth seen amongst most European or pale Arab populations. Many of them would have learned Arab or Portuguese customs, behaviours and language. However, Swahili would have been the trade language for those conquered on the eastern end of DR Congo. Some would have also adopted Islam at varying levels, whilst those taken to the coast of Angola would be what I describe as Catholicized on the coast of Angola. In the 19th century, Manyema regions leading up to Tanganyika and the southeastern part of Kasai was the region penetrated by Sultan Swahili Arabs who came via the East African coast on behalf of the Omani Empire. They had children with populations they enslaved who were sometimes referred to as Ombu or Ombo, Senzi, Mwa or Umbe, which were generic terms for what they deemed as enslaved savages and dwarf populations. Those who were enslaved in nearby Kasongo regions down to southeastern Kasai were referred to as Watetera. The enslaved Konda speaking populations in Manyema were nicknamed as Kusu by the Sultan Swahili Arabs because they had a custom of wearing parrot's feathers. The Sultan Swahili Arabs identified these populations via a teeth sharpening custom seen amongst the Umbe of North Kasai, which they described as dwarfs. The reason for these shifting terms to describe the enslaved was a result of mixed populations becoming bilingual, understanding the Konda, Kete and southern eastern Kasai languages, as well as the language of trade, which was Swahili. As one region became raided, the remaining population would be directed into a caravan to follow into another region where the commerce leader wants to raid, thus creating more mixed populations. A notable of this populace of enslaved people was a mixed-race man named Ngongolutet, who was a slave raider for another mixed-race Zanzibari Sultan Swahili who was nicknamed Tipu Tip. Tipu Tip got into power as the individual who either usurped or claimed kingship to a population Ngongolutet came from in the regions known as Kasongo down to southeastern Kasai regions. The details of this will be explained in another part of this Kasai story series, as this is one big story on its own. Now moving on, again in the 19th century, the Katanga regions was also penetrated by Sultan Swahili Arabs who came via the East African coast to then establish the Yeke kingdom, following their trade relations with the Luba kingdom. A Sultan Swahili Arab named Misiri would have had children with the local Luba populations of Katanga, thus developing communities of mixed-race people who continued slave raids on behalf of the Yeke kingdom and their Omani empire. Now looking at the western coast, we have to start around the mid-late 17th century. The Kingdom of Congo would have developed communities of mixed-race people handling commerce as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. They were referred to as Ambaquista and sometimes Luso-Africans. The Ambaquista would end up trading with Angolan raiders who would collectively end up creating trade routes and relations with Angolan Imbangala Kasanje up to the Lunda and Luba kingdoms. Leading up to the mid-19th century, all these raiding groups from either the west or east coast would end up reaching the far southern Kasai region on the southern end of what they described as the Kasabe River, closer to the Lunda kingdom. These raiding groups would have contributed to a range of mixed ethnicities descending from either Ambaquista, Luso or Arab. These 17th to 19th century raiding and usurping activities linked to kingdoms was no doubt the first signs of ethnic ambiguity being synonymous with conquest, rule, power and prestige that has not been seen before and perhaps become something to fear, considering raiders outside of Kasai came with guns which the indigenous inhabitants were unable to match with their arrows and knives. Also, these ambiguous leaders would have brought in never seen before trade items which added to the perception of prestige. The new perception of prestige would then lead some indigenous populations adopting and demanding some Arabic or European items, clothes and even sometimes the appearance of those who came from another land, i.e. the coast, as these items, clothes and appearances acting as a sign of prestige was synonymous with rule and power, which led to further distinctions amongst those considered as savages and those considered as civilized, who are to civilize the savages, which continues the works of the Ambaquistadors, Arabs or Luso-Africans. This now leaves us to question, where did the power and prestige come from via the Kuba kingdom, which was almost hidden in the Middle Western region in Kasai? Stay tuned for part 4.
Gana